The morning mist over the eastern edge of Westphalia clung to the ruined treetops like smoke that had forgotten what fire felt like. It was the first day of April in the spring of 1945, and the men of the American 84th Infantry Division were advancing toward the town of Ahlen. Their maps showed a settlement of factories, farm lanes, and railway sidings, nothing tactically special, nothing different from the dozens of places they had already passed through on their long march from the Dutch border into the dying core of Hitler's Reich. Yet the closer the platoon moved, the more the grey silence unsettled them. Towns that looked this intact rarely surrendered without a fight, and a fight, at that stage of the war, hardly ever stayed small. At the head of the column walked First Lieutenant James R. Timberlake, a man who had learned the hard way never to trust a quiet German village. The previous week he had watched two of his best scouts die in the space of a heartbeat when a farmhouse that looked abandoned erupted with panzerfaust fire from an upper window. You survived the final weeks of the war in Europe, so men said, not by being brave but by being suspicious. Suspicion kept you alive. Suspicion kept your platoon alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was close to 10 in the morning when Timberlake saw the movement. A tiny figure, a child, he realized only after lowering his rifle, a fraction stepped out from behind a road marker at the far end of a shattered hedgerow. The boy held something above his head, a cloth, pale and fluttering. For a moment, Timberlake couldn't tell whether it was a rag or simply a trick of the wind. The platoon dropped to the ground behind a low rise. The guns of nearby Sherman tanks traversed toward the figure. This was exactly how ambushes were, baited. One harmless shape drawing American fire long enough for hidden defenders to take their shots. But something about the way the boy stood arrested the lieutenant's attention. He wasn't frozen in fear, nor was he flinching at the rumble of American armor. He simply walked forward, steadily, as if he had rehearsed the motion again and again before morning broke. And the cloth he held, now Timberlake could see its shape clearly, was a white bedsheet tied around a broken branch. In the boy's other hand, barely visible, was a small satchel that bumped against his leg with every step. Behind him, beyond the hedgerow, Timberlake could just make out the silhouettes of houses, intact roofs, intact chimneys, too intact. He cursed under his breath. A town that looked that untouched could only mean one thing in 1945. German defenders were waiting inside, desperate or fanatical enough to make a stand even when the war was already lost. The boy walked until he was, barely 50 yards from the lead scouts. Then he stopped. He lowered the satchel, raised the white sheet even higher, and said something in German the Americans couldn't hear. "God help him," one of the sergeants muttered. "If this is a trick, he's not coming back." But Lieutenant Timberlake felt something else, something he hadn't felt for weeks. Not trust, exactly, but a kind of reluctant curiosity. Why would a child volunteer for something this dangerous? Why walk directly toward armed strangers in the last chaos-filled days of the war, when panicked men on both sides were shooting at anything that moved? He signaled for his translator, Corporal Bernard Fink, to stand beside him. "Let's hope this kid isn't carrying a grenade," Timberlake said quietly as they advanced. When they drew near, the boy spoke first rapid, breathless German. His hands trembled, but he didn't lower the white cloth. Corporal Fink listened, his expression shifting from tension to confusion, then to something like disbelief. "He says," Fink translated slowly, "that the town wants to surrender. He says the men still left inside will lay down their weapons if we promise not to shell the houses." Timberlake stared at the boy. The fog, the quiet, the white cloth, it all seemed too neat, too staged. A decoy, perhaps, to lure the Americans into lowering their guard. But the boy's voice, even through the translation, carried something that Timberlake had not heard from an enemy in months: sincerity. "What's in the bag?" Timberlake asked. The boy opened it. Inside were documents, the mayor's signature, the parish priest's seal, a letter explaining the situation. No weapons, no maps, just an offer of surrender drafted in haste. Corporal Fink let out a long breath. "Sir, I think this is real." Timberlake took the satchel and looked toward Ahlen again. If this was genuine, it meant something extraordinary was happening. The war, especially here in Western Germany during those final weeks, had taken on a brutal, automatic momentum. Many towns fought simply because fleeing Volkssturm leaders forced civilians at gunpoint to resist. Others fought because small bands of Hitler Youth believed surrender was treason punishable by execution. American infantry rarely saw a white flag until they had already blasted their way through the outer defenses. But this boy, no older than 14, maybe 15, had walked through the front lines alone. He was the white flag, he was the message, and if he failed, the cost would fall on him first. Timberlake lowered his rifle and exhaled the tension he had carried since dawn. "Tell him," he said to Fink, "we'll hear them out." That moment, the morning when a single child walked out with a ragged bedsheet, was the pivot upon which the fate of an entire town balanced. Yet the story of how he came to be there, and how the American platoon came to trust him, began long before that April morning. It began in a Germany collapsing under the weight of its own propaganda, in a society where children were taught to die for a regime that was already dead, and in an army of occupiers advancing through terrain where civilians were both victims and shields. To understand why the boy took that walk, and why the Americans accepted his offer, we must return to the world that made such a moment possible, a world of contradictions, fear, indoctrination, and the bitter unravelling of illusions that had sustained Germany through 6 years of war. Ahlen, the town toward which Timberlake's men were advancing, was no obscure village. It was a modest industrial centre in North Rhine-Westphalia, tied into the coal and steel economy of the Ruhr region. Its factories produced components for the German locomotive industry, and its surrounding mines fed coal to nearly every sector of wartime production. For the Allies pushing eastward in the final weeks of the European Mines Pacis campaign, towns like Ahlen had value less for tactical reasons than for administrative ones. They were the connective tissue of German civilian life. A peaceful surrender meant intact infrastructure, less risk to civilians, and fewer days spent rooting out snipers or fanatical holdouts. But in the spring of 1945, peaceful surrender was not something German civilians could assume. In fact, it was nearly impossible. From the first days of Hitler's rule in the 1930s, German youth had been shaped by a system that preached obedience, racial superiority, and sacrifice to the state. By the time the war turned catastrophically against Germany in 1944 and 1945, these children, many barely in their teens, were among the last to still believe the regime's promises. They had been told repeatedly that Allied soldiers would annihilate German civilians, that surrender was suicide, and that fighting to the death was the only honourable course. This messaging intensified as Germany's situation deteriorated. After the Allied landing in Normandy during the summer of 1944 and the collapse of the Western Front, the Nazi propaganda machine shifted into a frenzy. Radio broadcasts warned that American and British armies were agents of destruction sent to rape, pillage, and depopulate German towns. Party officials ordered the formation of the Volkssturm, the so-called People's Storm, a militia composed of men from 16 to 60, often poorly trained and armed with little more than old rifles, panzerfausts, or captured foreign weapons. The Hitler Youth, already steeped in militarized ideology, were expected to act as the glue that held this improvised force together. In Ahlen, like countless other towns, this doctrine ran directly against the lived reality of civilians who simply wanted the war to end with as little bloodshed as possible. Throughout the winter of 1944 and 1945, as Allied air raids intensified and reports of German defeats streamed in, the people of Ahlen were torn between two dangers. On one side was the advancing American Ninth Army, on the other side were their own Nazi officials, who considered surrender an act of treason punishable by immediate execution. Into this tense world grew a 14-year-old boy named Joseph Jupp Schüttler. Unlike the mythic tales of fanatical Hitler youth eager to die for the Reich, Schüttler was not a zealot. He was a boy shaped by contradictions. Indoctrinated at school, but raised by a family that understood the war was lost. Required to parade with Hitler youth formations, yet aware that the older boys who were drafted into last-ditch defense squads rarely came back. He had seen bombers pass overhead so often that their drone became background noise. He had watched coal trains leaving the station at all hours of the night, carrying the last remnants of a mobilized industrial system, collapsing under scarcity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. His moment of decision, the choice that would put him face to face with Timberlake's platoon, came at a council meeting on the night of March 30th. The mayor of Ahlen, together with the parish priest and several elders, had convened a secret gathering to discuss what to do when American forces reached the town. Rumours had already spread that Volkssturm members were preparing to defend Ahlen. Worse, a small group of radical Hitler youth, led by a 16-year-old named Hubert S., had threatened to execute any adult who suggested surrender. By 1945, the atmosphere in many German towns had descended into paranoia. The Gestapo had largely evacuated the western regions, but local Nazi officials still wielded authority. Civilians could not openly advocate surrender without putting themselves at risk. Yet everyone in that room knew that a battle in the narrow streets of Ahlen would bring devastation. American infantry doctrine in the final months of the war favoured overwhelming firepower mortar teams, softening defensive positions, heavy machine guns raking windows and alleys, tanks blasting apart suspected strongpoints. It was effective, but devastating for civilians trapped inside. Someone needed to make contact with the Americans before the town was caught in a crossfire. But the elders knew that if any adult left with a white flag, the radical youth patrols might shoot them in the back before they reached the American lines. Then, as one witness later recalled, the priest looked toward Joseph Schuttler. Children, ironically, were safer. Hitler Youth patrolled for adult defeatists, not for their own comrades. And a child walking with a white flag might be enough to signal peaceful intent without drawing immediate fire. There was a silence in the room. When the idea was spoken aloud, Joseph understood what was being asked of him. He had seen what happened in towns where American units suspected trickery. Houses shelled, streets torn open by tank fire, civilians killed when German soldiers ambushed Allied patrols from buildings whose windows still displayed white flags. But he also understood what would happen if his village mounted a pointless resistance. He had seen, only weeks earlier, the aftermath in neighbouring Ham, where pockets of German defenders had held out long enough to force the Americans to bombard entire blocks. 2 nights later, while the elders drafted a letter of surrender and secured the mayor's seal, Joseph prepared the only items he would carry: a bedsheet taken from his mother's linen cupboard, a broken branch stripped of bark to serve as a flagstaff, and a satchel containing the documents that explained Ahlen's request. He was given no escort and no weapon. Anything more than that would make the Americans think it was a trap. At dawn on April 1st, he set off alone. He moved through alleys to avoid the last-minute German patrols. Along the edge of the fields outside Ahlen, he could see the outlines of American infantry spread in a loose skirmish line, moving cautiously, rifles raised. Joseph had expected to be terrified. Instead, what he felt was something stranger, heavier, the weight of representing an entire community. If he failed, the division would shell the town. If he reached the Americans and they fired anyway, he would not feel a thing. Thus he walked forward, lifting the white cloth high into the pale spring air. This was the moment Lieutenant Timberlake encountered when he saw the boy emerge from the fog. It was not simply a gesture of surrender. It was a village's desperate gamble that the Americans, hardened by months of bloodshed and wary of deception, might still recognize a genuine plea when they saw one. The American platoon had been conditioned to expect treachery. During the preceding months, particularly after the Ardennes offensive in the winter of 1944 and 1945, U.S. infantry units had faced numerous attacks conducted under false flags, staged surrenders, or sham negotiations used to lure patrols into kill zones. The psychological toll of fighting in Germany against a collapsing but still unpredictable enemy made even acts of goodwill appear suspicious. And yet, when Joseph approached, nothing about him looked staged. His boots were worn, His hands shook. The satchel he carried was made of coarse fabric, stitched long before the war. The bedsheet tied to the branch still smelled faintly of laundry soap. Timberlake had been in combat long enough to tell when a man or a boy was lying, and whatever Joseph said through Corporal Fink, it did not sound like a lie. The boy told them that Ahlen wished to surrender peacefully, that the able-bodied men had already hidden or thrown away their weapons, and that the mayor and priest were waiting with him on the outskirts of the village. If the Americans accepted their surrender, the town would open its roads, evacuate any remaining Volkssturm members who refused to comply, and allow U.S. forces to occupy administrative buildings without resistance. Timberlake hesitated for a long moment. He considered the map. He considered the previous week's ambush, and he considered the boy standing bravely before him, clutching a white flag he barely understood the symbolism of, yet fully understood the consequence of. War had a way of destroying all illusions, but occasionally it revealed something else, an unexpected shard of human clarity, cutting through the noise. After a full breath, he nodded. "Take us to your mayor," he said, and with that, the platoon followed the boy toward Ahlen, uncertain of what they would find, but aware they were walking into a town unlike any other they had seen that month. The approach to Ahlen unfolded with a slowness that made every footstep feel deliberate. The Americans advanced in a staggered column, rifles angled toward windows and rooflines, while Joseph Schuttler walked ahead of them, gripping the makeshift white flag so tightly his knuckles turned pale. Lieutenant Timberlake kept several paces behind the boy, watching his posture, the tilt of his head, the way he scanned the ground. A child could act nervous for many reasons, but Joseph's demeanor did not resemble the rehearsed fear he had seen in decoys. It looked like genuine terror mixed with an even more genuine resolve. As the platoon passed the first row of houses, Timberlake noticed something unusual. The curtains were still drawn, but not in that taut, sculpted way he had seen in towns preparing an ambush. Instead, they sagged, as if hands had released them hurriedly. Doors were closed, but not barricaded, and the street itself bore signs of a retreating civilian life, an abandoned pram, an overturned handcart, a bundle of firewood left on a doorstep. What he did not see were firing slits in shutters, sandbag emplacements, or fresh shell casings in the gutters. The absence of these signs did not guarantee safety, but in the final spring of the war, a village without improvised defences was increasingly rare. Timberlake walked beside Corporal Fink, who carried the satchel of surrender documents. "What's he saying now?" the lieutenant asked, as Joseph muttered softly in German. "He says we're almost there," Fink replied. "The mayor is waiting at the old brickworks office. He says the priest is there too, says they've been awake all night." They passed a bakery whose windows were cracked from earlier concussions, and Timberlake noticed loaves inside, half-kneaded, abandoned on the counter. The town had been preparing for bread when war intruded again. These small details told him more about the truth of the situation than any letter could. The closer they came to the brickworks, the more the Americans saw what Joseph had tried to describe: a village suspended between obedience and rebellion, between fear of its own authorities and fear of the U.S. Army. The propaganda that had shaped German life for years still hung like invisible smoke over every doorway. Civilians had been told repeatedly that surrender meant annihilation, that American soldiers were barbarians hungry for retribution. The image of the enemy as a monster was so deeply embedded that even when the front collapsed and neighbouring towns surrendered peacefully, many Germans still believed they would be massacred the moment the Stars and Stripes appeared. This was what made Ahlen's decision remarkable. Not the act of surrender itself, but the willingness to trust the unknown. At the entrance to the brickworks courtyard, Joseph paused. He looked back at Timberlake and pointed toward the office. A handful of figures waited outside, older men, some still wearing work clothes dusted with coal grit. None held weapons, and standing at the centre was the mayor, a tall, gaunt man in his 50s with a white armband tied around his coat sleeve. Next to him stood the parish priest, Father Ludwig Evermann, easily identifiable by the black coat and narrow white collar. He too wore a white cloth around his arm, though his hands trembled more visibly than the mayor's. Timberlake ordered 2 scouts to move ahead. They approached the group cautiously, checking corners and scanning the windows above. When they signaled the all clear, Timberlake walked forward, with Corporal Fink translating by his side. The mayor spoke first, his voice rough but steady. "I am Ernst Becker," he said in German. "I offer the unconditional surrender of Ahlen. There will be no resistance if your troops enter the town. We ask only that artillery fire be suspended and that civilians be allowed to evacuate dangerous areas under your direction." Fink relayed the message. Timberlake studied Becker's face. There was no arrogance there, no attempt to bargain, no trace of the defiant posturing he had encountered in some other villages. Becker's expression conveyed something far older and far more honest. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had carried the burden of a crumbling community for too long. The priest spoke next, his words spilling out faster than Fink could translate. He explained how local Nazi officials had fled the previous night, how the last Volkssturm commander had disappeared with a handful of youths, how the people of Ahlen had torn down the last remnants of party banners that morning, and how, above all else, they feared the Americans would interpret the remaining traces of militarization as evidence of resistance. Then came the part that struck Timberlake hardest. The priest, touching the boy's shoulder, said, "This child walked with our message because he was the only one whom the radicals would not recognize as a threat. He saved this town before you arrived." Timberlake glanced at Joseph, who looked down, embarrassed, or simply overwhelmed. Trust is a strange currency in war. It accumulates slowly, painfully, and can evaporate in an instant. Yet something about the plainness of the scene, an exhausted mayor, a trembling priest, a boy with a bedsheet, made the decision easier than logic alone could explain. Timberlake called for his platoon sergeant. "Signal the rear. Tell the company commander Ahlen is surrendering. No artillery, no tanks forward until we sweep the streets." The sergeant nodded, relief passing quickly across his face. The men had expected another brutal street fight. A peaceful entry was a gift they did not take lightly. Timberlake turned back to the mayor. "We accept," he said. When Fink translated the word, Becker closed his eyes, just briefly, as if setting down a weight he had carried for years. The Americans moved quickly after that. Patrols were dispatched to secure key intersections. Surrendering men were gathered and registered. Weapons, mostly ancient rifles, a few panzerfaust tubes, and several pistols were collected and stacked in the courtyard. The Americans found no prepared ambushes, no hidden machine guns, no fanatic snipers. It was, by the standards of 1945, a miracle. Joseph remained near the priest while the Americans worked. He watched as soldiers swept buildings, checked rooftops, and coordinated with the mayor about barricades that had to be removed. He saw how cautiously the Americans handled civilians, maintaining distance but showing no aggression. The myths he had been fed for years, the stories of torture, destruction, and cruelty crumbled the longer he observed them. But the deeper shift came not from what he saw the Americans do, but from the reaction of his own villagers. For the first time since the war had begun, the adults around him no longer looked afraid of expressing relief. The tension that had gripped everyone for months loosened. People brought out bread for the American patrols. Children peeked from windows and, after enough encouragement, emerged from hiding to stand at the edges of the courtyard. Women carried buckets of water to the soldiers to help wash coal dust from their hands. Timberlake, for his part, moved through the town with steady diligence. He ensured that the American medics examined an elderly man who had collapsed from anxiety. He assigned a squad to inspect the schoolhouse, where the last Hitler Youth meetings had been held, to ensure no explosives were hidden inside. And though he rarely stopped moving, he noticed Joseph watching him from a distance. There was a moment, mid-afternoon, when Timberlake approached the boy. "You knew we wouldn't shoot," Timberlake said quietly after Fink translated. "You trusted that." Joseph hesitated, then shook his head. He answered in German, and Fink translated, "I hoped you wouldn't shoot. That is different." That simple distinction struck Timberlake more deeply than he expected. Hope, not certainty, had carried the boy through enemy lines. The lieutenant crouched so that they were eye level. "Why you?" he asked. Joseph looked toward the brickworks, toward the place where the secret meeting had taken place days earlier. He seemed to choose his words carefully. "Because the grown men are watched," Fink translated. "Because the older boys would stop them. Because the people trusted me not to be afraid." Timberlake nodded. He could imagine the pressure placed on this child. In the final collapse of the Reich, children were often the last to hold on to propaganda. Yet here was one who had resisted that narrative not with force, but with a gesture as old as warfare itself. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the low industrial roofs of Ahlen, the company commander arrived to confirm the surrender. He congratulated Timberlake on avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. He congratulated the mayor for the courage to negotiate under threat of retribution. But he paused the longest when he was introduced to Joseph, asking Fink to translate a simple sentence: "You saved lives today, ours and theirs." Joseph blinked rapidly, unsure what to say. The company commander turned to Timberlake. "We're moving on tomorrow morning. Leave a small detachment, but the town is secure." It was only after the commander left that Timberlake considered the full magnitude of what had happened. In a war punctuated by treachery, improvisation, and endless suspicion, a single child had managed to bridge the chasm between two worlds. Not through training, not through strategy, but through an act that many adults would have been terrified to attempt. Later that night, while the American platoon set up temporary quarters in the town hall, Timberlake wrote a brief entry into his field notebook, something he seldom had time or energy for anymore. Ahlen surrendered without a fight. A boy came out with a white flag. If he had hesitated, this place would be rubble by now. He did not embellish it. War did not need embellishment. In the houses nearby, the people of Ahlen slept without fear of shelling for the first time in months. And in one small room above the bakery, Joseph Schuttler finally let the exhaustion wash over him. His mother, who had been told only after his return what he had done, held his hand until he fell asleep. The propaganda that had shaped his childhood, the insistence that the enemy was merciless, that surrender was death, had finally been replaced by the evidence of his own experience. It had taken only a few hours, but those hours reshaped his understanding of the world more profoundly than years of indoctrination. And for the Americans, Joseph's act served as a rare reminder in the closing weeks of the war. Not every German town wanted to fight to the last bullet. Not every boy believed the lies he had been taught. Not every white flag was a trick. Some were lifelines, fragile, improbable, but real. Morning in Ahlen arrived cautiously, as though the light itself were unsure whether it was welcome. A thin mist clung to the rooftops, and the first sound to break the silence was the rattle of American trucks, rolling toward the market square. The townspeople had expected chaos, shouting, boots kicking down doors, interrogations in the streets. They had heard rumors of what occupation looked like in the East stories, exaggerated or warped, but frightening enough to live in the collective imagination. What they saw instead was an orderly procession. The Americans entered with calm, practiced efficiency. Each squad fanned out to predetermined checkpoints, marking intersections with flags and guiding nervous civilians out of potential danger zones. The discipline with which they moved told the villagers something important. These men had done this many times before. They were not here to punish, they were here to secure. And behind all of it lay the unspoken truth: this place should have been rubble. Joseph felt that reality most keenly. He walked beside Father Everman, watching as American medics set up a temporary aid station in front of the schoolhouse. Just a day earlier, he had tried to imagine the future of Ahlen, only to find that every version he conjured ended in flames. Now the future seemed to be rebuilding itself in front of his eyes, one cautious gesture at a time. It was Lieutenant Timberlake who finally put words to the thought everyone else had avoided. He stood with Mayor Becker in the courtyard of the brickworks, looking at a map unfolded across a delivery crate. "You need to understand something," he said, waiting for Fink to translate. This town was minutes away from being shelled. Orders were already in motion. Becker stiffened, though the information was not entirely surprising. He had seen the glow on the northern horizon the night before. He had heard the distant pounding of artillery, Ahlen had been next. Timberlake tapped a finger on the map. You surrendered early enough for us to stop the guns. One wrong signal, one misunderstanding, one nervous soldier. Things would be different. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Becca swallowed hard. Then it is the boy who saved us, he said. Timberlake didn't disagree. By mid-morning, American engineers began surveying the surrounding fields and industrial yards. They were checking for mines, booby traps, and explosive caches, things retreating forces sometimes left behind. The townspeople gathered at windows and doorways, murmuring prayers that none had been planted. They were lucky. No mines, no demolition wires, no desperate last-minute orders had been carried out. The engineers wrote in their reports that Ahlen was clean, a dry military term that obscured a far more emotional reality for the people who lived there. Clean meant safe. Clean meant spared. Clean meant this place, these homes, this bakery, this school would continue to exist. Joseph watched one squad as they cleared a section near the old coal tower. A soldier crouched to inspect a suspicious-looking bundle. The boy held his breath, expecting an explosion, but the soldier stood up, shaking his head, holding a rusted tangle of scrap wire. Joseph exhaled shakily. It's like we were skipped, he murmured to himself. No, Father Everman replied, overhearing. It is because you walked out there yesterday. Joseph said nothing. He couldn't reconcile the idea that something so simple, so stupid, as he had called it, could have such a monumental outcome. That afternoon, Timberlake personally oversaw the final sweep of the town. The Americans did not break doors. They knocked. They did not shout. They spoke firmly. They did not ransack. They searched for weapons and moved on. In house after house, they encountered frightened civilians who were astonished to realize that the American soldiers treated them not as enemies, but as human beings. In one home, an elderly woman burst into tears when the soldiers entered, convinced they had come to kill her. When they simply checked her basement and left, she collapsed into a chair, whispering, "They lied to us. They lied about everything." Timberlake overheard similar remarks throughout the day. It reinforced something he already knew. Propaganda was not just a political tool. It shaped fear at a bone-deep level. When the sweep was completed with no resistance, no hidden fighters, no last-ditch attacks, Timberlake noted again in his logbook, town fully secured, no hostile activity. Civilian cooperation high. Credit goes to early surrender initiated by boy named Joseph. He underlined the last sentence. News travelled quickly among the American units. Ahlen had surrendered without firing a shot. In a war where nearly every village hid a fanatic in a rooftop or a sniper in a barn loft, such an event stood out. Some soldiers grumbled they had expected action, and action was what young men often thought they wanted, but most expressed relief. They were tired of losing friends in pointless last-gasp firefights. A peaceful surrender meant they could move on without adding new graves to the roadside. That night, the company commander addressed a small gathering of villagers and American officers in the courtyard. His tone was solemn but sincere. "Your town lives because you chose reason over ruin," he said, "and because one boy took the risk that many grown men wouldn't dare." Joseph stood behind the priest during the speech, trying not to be noticed. But people noticed him anyway. Some nodded at him with gratitude, others with awe. A few still seemed conflicted, embarrassed that a child had done what they themselves had feared to do. War had a way of distorting pride. Later that evening, Timberlake sat on the church steps, taking a rare moment of quiet. Joseph approached hesitantly, hands clasped behind his back. "You will leave tomorrow?" he asked in German. Fink, standing nearby, translated. "Yeah," Timberlake replied. "We move east at first light." Joseph nodded. He seemed to wrestle with something internally, searching for words. "My father," he began softly. "He said once that a man must tell the truth, even when he is afraid of it." Timberlake gestured for him to continue. "I was afraid of you," Joseph admitted, terrified. "But also, I was afraid of what would happen if I did nothing. I didn't walk out there because I was brave." I walked because there was no one else to do it. Timberlake didn't smile, but his expression softened. That is bravery, he said. Joseph looked surprised, as though he had never considered the possibility. And the white flag? Timberlake asked. That was your idea? Joseph hesitated, then shrugged. It was all we had. It looked so foolish that I hoped you would laugh before you shot. Timberlake chuckled under his breath. But it also looked honest. For a long moment, they sat together in silence, an American soldier and a German boy, on the steps of a church in the last weeks of the deadliest war in human history. Finally, Timberlake stood, straightened his jacket, and held out his hand. Joseph shook it. At dawn, the American column moved out. Engines rumbled, boots thudded, and the long line of vehicles stretched toward the eastern roads. Ahlen's residents gathered quietly to watch them leave. Some waved timidly. A few brought out baskets of bread and apples to hand to passing soldiers. When Timberlake's jeep rolled forward, Joseph raised his hand in a small wave. The lieutenant returned it with a nod, subtle but unmistakably respectful. The last truck disappeared over the slight rise in the road. For the first time since the war began, the town no longer felt like an island awaiting destruction. It felt like a place that had rejoined the living world. Other towns in the region heard the story, the one about the boy from Ahlen who walked alone to the American lines. Some believed it, others called it embellished. After all, countless stories emerged in the final collapse of the Reich: sacrifices, betrayals, miracles, tragedies. But in Ahlen, they knew the truth. When Allied historians later reviewed the military logs from the advance into the Ruhr, they found the entry in Timberlake's handwriting, a short, unadorned sentence. Town surrendered early due to actions of one boy with white flag. History often remembers generals. It remembers battles, treaties, and dates. But in this case, the survival of a town, every street, every family, every future child who would grow up there, hung not on a general's decision, but on the judgment of a frightened boy who believed that even in a world drowning in hatred, mercy was still possible. It was, by all accounts, a stupid plan. A sheet on a stick, a child walking into enemy guns, a gamble so reckless that any adult would have dismissed it. But it worked. And because it worked, Ahlen did not burn. Because it worked, hundreds did not die. Because it worked, the war ended for one town at least without another page of tragedy. Humanity survived there because one boy insisted it could. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.